Okay, guys, this will be our last video lecture of the semester. So let's jump into it. I want to focus on the strange and amazing story of Cortez and the conquest of the New World. Your book mentions it and gives a little space to it, but the story itself is weirder than you can believe. And it is one of those odd moments in history that sound like some kind of science fiction story. It really does. And in some ways, science fiction might be uh, a good metaphor for that time. Um, you know, a new world was discovered. Now, people knew the world was round, and they knew it from the time of the ancient Greeks. That was a kind of an urban myth, I guess, that uh, was very current. Even in, when I was a kid, I was taught that Columbus discovered that the Earth was round, or guessed that the Earth was round and proved it right, which is so not true. But despite knowing the Earth was a globe and that it was large, uh, they weren't sure exactly how large, and they didn't know what was on the other side. Uh, Columbus's expedition was actually an attempt to get to the East Indies. The sale of spices and silks and things that you can find in the Orient were fabulously uh, well, they had enormous value, more valuable than gold, and uh, it was worth the try to go, uh, you know, get to the east by going west, go across the ocean, and arrive on the other side of the globe, and that's what Columbus was trying to do. And the reason that the islands he landed on are called the West Indies is because he mistook them at first for the East Indies. And it wasn't very long after that that people realized there's a whole new world here. There's another continent. There's an unexplored realm, and there's people living on it. And that was an enormous shock. And imagine, just imagine, if you lived in those times, the mystery of this new world, this new continent, with people that no one had ever seen before in Western civilization, people whose existence wasn't even dreamed of. And those people that they encountered in the New World were very strange to them. Uh, Oddly, they had a whole lot of silver and gold and precious gems. Um, that's weird, isn't it? That these indigenous civilizations, the Maya, the Inca, the Aztecs, were just awash in gold. And these explorers discovering this world for the first time, that's one of the first things they're going to notice is, hey, these people are playing with these things like they're just ordinary stuff. There's lots and lots of it. And what that brings up is this kind of dual motivation behind the conquistadors, especially the explorers coming from Spain. Hold on, my camera is wobbling like crazy. Maybe if I just be more still. Um, the this is right on the verge of the Protestant Reformation is when this discovery of the New World happens, and Martin Luther hasn't arrived on the scene yet, but he's about to. Uh, so the conquistadors begin their conquest of the New World at the very tail end of what we think of as Christendom, the civilization of Europe united under the Catholic Church, and Spain was a very religious country. Well, all countries were very religious countries. Remember, this is Europe under the domination of the Catholic Church, and their motivation, in part, in when they found out there were people in this new world, was to convert them to Christianity. And it's easy to be cynical about that and say, well, they just wanted the gold and silver and jewels and the wealth and the slaves and all the other things they could get here. And they used their desire for conversion as kind of a ruse to achieve those other more corrupt and worldly ends. But if you look at the accounts they give of themselves, they seem to have been very sincere about this. And they went about it in different ways. And there was a great controversy about how horribly the Spanish treated the native people that they encountered. I mean, even Columbus, right, he was a Portuguese, but um, working for Spain. But he used to be a great hero. We had Columbus Day when I was a kid, and now I was like, oh well, yeah, it was great, except for all the rape and plunder and murder that he committed. Um, little side note to history, by the way. Karma is a concept, a mystical concept that I happen to personally believe in. I think I see evidence of it out there in the world. But um, syphilis, the disease of syphilis, was the only disease to go the other way across the Atlantic. The New World brought terrible plagues into the native populations of the New World. And that accounted for a great deal for the success of the conquest of the New World, is that millions of native people were just wiped out by plagues that were brought from Europe with the explorers. But syphilis was a disease native to the people that Columbus ran into, and his people brought it back to Europe with him. And um, it was uncurable for a very long time. It was much more virulent of a disease in the beginning when people's immune systems had never encountered it before. People's faces literally melted off of them with the syphilis. You can look it up if you want to. It's horrific what the disease was like. And it also drove people slowly insane. And the symptoms of insanity from syphilis are paranoia and delusions of grandeur, among other things. And of the famous people of our history who were thought to have had syphilis, Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler are on that list. And so, maybe, just maybe, the Western world got payback for what Columbus was up to. I don't know. But that's a little footnote to this history. Um, and I think that to understand these people, you have to realize that these two competing motivations were at work. They wanted the wealth and the gold and the slaves and the power, but they also wanted to convert these people to Christianity. And that thread of this desire to convert the natives runs through all of this terrible history. It is also untrue that the Catholic Church supported the rape and conquest of the New World. Um, the Pope at that time, I forget his name, but in somewhere around 1530, he wrote an encyclical. An encyclical is it's a letter from the Pope to the Church at large, saying this is how things should be done. And one of the ideas that began to circulate amongst these explorers and conquerors, conquistadors, was the idea that the native peoples they were running into weren't quite human. And we'll get into that in a little more depth in a few moments as to why they felt that way. But that was kind of a thought that was percolating around, and different people were kind of floating that idea that, well, maybe these aren't really people. And the Pope's encyclical says in no uncertain terms that these are human beings, that they are capable of reason, and that to um, rob them of their property, their freedom, or their lives is a grave sin. And the Pope even says, even if they don't follow our religion. So the fact that they're not Christians is no excuse for that behavior, which means that a great deal of the crimes that the conquistadors committed against the native peoples were a grave sin, according to the church that they purportedly represented. And so that kind of sets the background for the story of Cortez. And Cortez's story is crazy, guys. I'm just going to hit some highlights of it. There's so much that goes on here. It would make a great movie. Someone should do a science fiction movie about discovering a new planet, but make it the story of Cortez. Goodness, somebody has to have already done that. So Cortez begins as a aide to the governor of what is now Cuba, Diego Velazquez. Cortez is with Velazquez when they invade and kind of conquer Cuba, which was a cakewalk. Cuba wasn't really inhabited by anybody that could challenge them at all. And the Spanish kind of established a foothold in the New World in Cuba. Um, Cortez rises to prominence in this area uh, because he's a man of courage and daring and imagination and intelligence, and he's also pretty ruthless. And immediately there begins this rivalry between Velasquez and Cortez. Um, they're kind of at odds with one another, and they have this kind of off and on again antagonism towards one another, where Velasquez will find Cortez useful, and then he'll piss him off, and now Cortez is on the outs again. And Velasquez is always uh, anxious about what Cortez could be up to. Velasquez recognizes in Cortez someone who could supplant him and take his place. Um, Rumors, because while this is happening, while they're establishing this new Spanish colony in Cuba, people are trickling over a few expeditions um, uh, to the mainland, to what is now Mexico, take place. And Velasquez does not let Cortez lead any of them. He does not want Cortez in charge of anything like that. But from these initial explorations, rumors began to trickle back that there's a whole civilization over there that has fantastic wealth, that there's this gold and silver. The beginnings of the legend of El Dorado, the city made of gold, begin in this time. And Cortez is really interested in finding out what's over there. He wants to take an expedition and be the one who discovers this civilization and claims it for the Christian faith and for the Kingdom of Spain. Velasquez allows Cortez to get an expedition together. And Cortez puts together a pretty paltry expedition. He has a few ships, enough to carry 600 men. He has about a dozen cannons or so and a handful of cavalry units, so mounted knights. But not many, no more than 20 horses total in this expedition. On the eve of Cortez leaving on this expedition, Velasquez changes his mind. He says, "No way, I can't believe I've done this. I did it. I let him in charge of one of these." And he rescinds his charter. He says, "No, you can't do this. I'm not allowing you to lead this expedition." Cortez simply ignores the order and leaves anyway. And when he gets to the mainland, now imagine, try to put yourself in these people's shoes, right? They've got 600 men, some cannons, and some horses. And they land on the shores of this unexplored alien world. No few of Cortez's soldiers were unnerved by this. And so Cortez does this particularly ruthless thing. It's an old gesture in human military history, but Cortez is one of the more dramatic examples of this. He burns his ships. He literally burns their only way to get back to Cuba. And so the intention there is, well, now we either succeed or we die. There's no going back. And so this is how Cortez arrives in the New World. And almost immediately they run into native resistance. A local area ponies up an army and opposes Cortez. And they fight a pitched battle there in the very beginning of his conquest of Mexico against one of the native rulers of that area. And Cortez wins the battle easily. And this is something I want to emphasize as we go through the rest of this story. Once again, you can't make this stuff up. The warfare of the Aztecs was very different from the warfare of European Christendom. Um, in this way, they did not have steel. That's the first thing, right? No steel. They did not have gunpowder. Now, the guns that the Spanish would have had available to them, the small cannons that they had, were not great. We're at the very dawn of gunpowder being an issue in warfare. You still have knights in plate steel armor, and that's what the conquistadors are wearing. Guns are loaded very slowly, right? They're dangerous to shoot. They're not accurate. But they're beginning to be an issue on the battlefield at this time. The technology has arrived at the point where there's starting to be something to be reckoned with. The Aztecs don't have horses. They've never seen a horse. The horses that are in America now, okay, any wild horse in America is a descendant of the horses that Cortez brought with him on that expedition. Okay, so that's how horses get to the New World. And so the Spanish have steel, gunpowder, horses. The Aztecs fought with clubs. Clubs that were often edged with obsidian, but obsidian is incredibly brittle. And so your obsidian-edged club, so this would be an ornate, very, these weren't crude weapons. They were highly decorative, very skillfully made war clubs. But your obsidian, they would actually insert obsidian chips down the length of the club to make a kind of blade out of it. But you only get a few whacks with that before the obsidian breaks. The armor that the Aztecs wore was entirely cloth and feathers. Lots of padding, which is great against clubs and absolutely useless against steel-edged blades. In some ways, the Aztecs' tactics and their technology was almost perfectly ineffective against what the Spanish were bringing with them to these battles. And the other issue is that Aztec warfare was largely ritualistic, and we'll get to that in a moment. There were rules and taboos and conventions built into their religion and their worship as applied to how they waged warfare. Whereas the Spaniards are like, kill them all. That's how you win a battle, right? Just go and get everybody. Aztec, and we'll get to this more in detail later. I don't want to jump the gun here, but the Aztecs' warfare was primarily to get living captives for human sacrifice, which is a very different way about going about fighting a battle. And so one of the things that happened in this conquest of the New World repeatedly, not just with Cortez, but with other explorers and other conquistadors, is they would be faced with overwhelming numbers of native forces, arrayed up to do pitched battle with them and destroy them all. And they would just go through them like they weren't there. They would kill hundreds of native warriors for every single Spanish knight that died in one of these battles. And for the very devout Catholic Spanish soldiers involved in these battles, this seemed pretty miraculous, honestly. The way that many of these battles went kind of led into this idea of we're supposed to conquer these people. So that happens with Cortez in his first foray into the mainland. And now remember, I said Aztec warfare is ritualistic. You lose a battle, you give stuff up, specifically people. And the chieftain that loses this battle with Cortez does the right thing by his own cultural understanding of how this thing should go, and he simply gives Cortez 20 young female slaves. Among these slaves is a woman named Malinche, and she becomes Cortez's mistress. Now, remember, Cortez, and the things that Cortez says, things that Cortez does, he's Catholic, Christian, all about converting the New World to Christianity. But this does not keep him from taking a mistress and a slave woman from among the slaves he's suddenly offered by this guy he's beaten in battle. And she becomes this kind of mythic figure in Aztec history. The Aztecs call her La Malinche. And as best anyone can figure out, Malinche was corresponded to an Aztec word for captain or commander. And La Malinche means the captain's woman. And she is absolutely pivotal in everything that happens after this, because she can speak Spanish, she learned Spanish, and she speaks the Aztec language. And no one else does. Cortez doesn't have anyone who can translate for him with the Aztecs. She becomes that person. And so she's present through all of this and survives everything that happens here as we go forward. But without her to talk to the native peoples, Cortez could not have gained the support from the Aztecs that he got. And that's the next thing to understand. Cortez did not win this war with his 600 men. He won it with 600 men, a few horses and cannons, and a whole lot of native warriors. And the way this worked was, as Cortez advanced towards the capital of the Aztec Empire, which was Tenochtitlan at that time, was the name of the city. And the city was an island in the middle of a lake with causeways leading to it. That'll become important later. But all these little villages and other satellite cities around this central city were under the rulership and domination of that central city. Now, the ancient world, and we discussed at the beginning of the semester with the city-states and the empires created by these city-states, well, that's what Tenochtitlan is. It is one of these. It's a city-state that has conquered all the other cities around them and pulled them into their sway. And for the Aztecs at the capital, the Aztecs in the surrounding villages and cities existed for the purpose of victims for human sacrifice, amongst other things. And so one of the things that would happen is kind of a ritual warfare between the Aztecs and these outlying villages. There would just be a time when, okay, they're going to come and get human sacrifices from us. And they would fight these kind of ritualistic mock sort of battles. And when the battle was over, the Aztecs would take their captives back to the capital, where they would sacrifice them to their gods. As you can imagine, the outlying villages, when they see a chance to get out from under this, take it. All of a sudden, here are these guys that we can't beat in battle, right? That have these amazing weapons, and they are marching towards Tenochtitlan. And so all of these outlying villages allied with Cortez. And so Cortez begins these 600 men. He wins this one battle. He marches towards Tenochtitlan, and as he goes, his ranks swell with all of these native warriors who are like, yeah, we're coming to get you. We're going to the capital. And then it gets even weirder. There is actually, now some historians debate this, but there's a lot of academic accolades for coming up with alternative versions of history. And so there are historians who doubt this, but the story is, sorry, I've got something crawling on my computer. There's good evidence that this is true. That, oops, there on the camera. Sorry guys, hang on. I'm failing. Hold on. I've got to get back to my camera. Yes, now maybe you can see me. Why is it not working? Sorry guys. You can all say, okay, boomer, in one voice now, right? The old dude with the technology. Okay, are we back? Yes, we're back. All right. Where was I? Oh, there's a legend in the Aztec mythology about one of their main gods, which is the feathered serpent. You see in the Aztec architecture a lot of these representations of the feathered serpent. It's one of their chief main gods. That a representative of that god would show up someday, and they would have white skin and be wearing shining clothes. And Cortez is wearing Spanish armor, and so are his men, and he's white. And the ruler of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma, thinks this is the one. And remember the Spanish have won this battle and are just marching through here, and they seem to be this amazing, powerful, unbeatable force. And they've got this technology no one's ever seen. And you could see how Moctezuma might make that mistake. And so he comes out and welcomes Cortez and his troops into the city. And they move in. And I've put in your supplemental material several things related to what we're going to be talking about, what we have talked about here. But one of those things is the very last thing there is Cortez's own description of the city. And it was an amazing city. It was one of the largest cities in the world at that time. And it had hundreds of thousands of people living in it, and it had temples, and it had streets, and there was gold everywhere, and there was and Cortez was amazed that a civilization that had nothing to do with Christianity at all or paganism, right? Something completely different from anything that they had ever encountered, could put together a civilization highly organized, sophisticated, full of culture and art and religion in this way. And so Cortez moves in, and Moctezuma starts hanging out with the conquistadors. Now, what happens is that they basically take Moctezuma captive. It doesn't look like that at first. It just looks like okay, our representative of the gods has showed up, and the ruler of the Aztecs is hanging out with them. But Cortez isn't about to let Moctezuma take control of this city. And Moctezuma officially gave Cortez the city when they first met. One of the things he says is, "You have the city now, great representative of the serpent god, the winged serpent, feathered serpent." And so Cortez begins trying to convert the place to Christianity. He starts going and tearing down the idols from the temples, and starts trying to preach to these people about the Christian faith. And he thinks he's doing a good job. He's kind of got this under control. This was easier than he thought it was going to be. But as you can imagine, tensions began to develop as these new people who were thought to be representatives of the gods or demigods themselves are now knocking things down and contradicting the religion that these gods are supposed to represent. Now, a crucial thing happens at this moment, that the whole story kind of turns on this incident. Velasquez is losing his mind in Cuba. He knows Cortez is loose on the continent and is probably doing okay, or he's afraid he's doing okay. And Velasquez had ambitions of his own to go and conquer the New World for Spain. And he sends an army of about 1,000 men in more boats to go and arrest Cortez and bring him back to Cuba in chains. He sends them to get him. Cortez somehow hears word of this. Now remember, as Cortez has marched towards Tenochtitlan, he's developed all of these allies along the way. So he can get information through a network of the people that he has run into as he's moving towards Tenochtitlan. And through that network, he finds out that this other Spanish force has arrived on the coast with no good intent towards him. And so he takes his army. He leaves, how many? 200, 300, something like that? I've got something here. He leaves 200 soldiers in Tenochtitlan under the command of a subordinate who's named Pedro de Alvarado. And Cortez is like, "We got this, everything's going great, just take care of this until I get back." And he takes his army, and he goes and confronts the forces that have come to arrest him and fights a pitched battle with them and wins it. And after the battle, he gets a chance to talk to the people who survived the battle, which there are many. And he says, "Listen, guys, there's gold everywhere here. I've got this. They welcome me into their city. They think I'm their god. You can just go pick up gold practically off the streets. Why don't you join me?" And they say, "Okay." And so he leaves with this army to fight these people. He brings them back with him. He's now got reinforcements. But something happens while he's gone. And the accounts of this, there are some contemporaneous accounts from the Aztec perspective and also from the Spanish perspective, and they differ. And there's a great deal of speculation. We don't know exactly what happened, but the bare bones of it are this. The Aztecs in the city have one of their major festivals planned. It's a thing that they do as part of their religion and their kind of their calendar of things that they do. And they have this ceremony. The ceremony happens in the central square in the middle of the city. And in the middle of this ceremony, the forces left in Tenochtitlan, under the command of this subordinate, attack the Aztecs who were involved in this religious ceremony. And they massacre them. And then the Spanish kind of draw back into their little area where they're at and kind of board themselves up and get ready to defend the place. And that moment kind of, I think it's a little easier to decipher than the historians that I've read about it. Why would he do this, right? Why would this person who left in charge of a situation that was under control, they've got the ruler of the Aztecs living with them, the Aztecs have received them peacefully, there's gold everywhere. They're in the process of tearing down the idols and converting the city to Christianity. Why does he suddenly order the massacre of all of these people in this religious ceremony? And to get to the answer to that, you have to know something about what Aztec religion was like. Remember how I said that their ritual warfare with these outlying cities was about getting victims for human sacrifice. Human sacrifice was a big part of the Aztec religion, and cannibalism as well. And in most of these ancient religions where you see human sacrifice, you will also see cannibalism. It's kind of a feature of that thing. And one of the things, I've got a picture of this in your supplemental material. One of the things that Cortez describes in the city of Tenochtitlan is this enormous tower made out of skulls, human skulls. And for many years, all the way up until a few years ago actually, people thought that Cortez's description of this thing was exaggerated. That what Cortez said he saw there in Tenochtitlan was exaggerated by the Spanish to justify their subsequent conquest of the Aztecs. But not too long ago, people digging around and doing construction in what is now Mexico City, which sits exactly on where Tenochtitlan was, they found the thing. They found the foundations of this enormous tower of human skulls. And it is huge. I'm going to pull up the dimensions of it here. I've got this in somewhere. I'm not sure if I have the sizes of it here. It was about the size of 3 football fields from what I remember, and about 30 yards tall. It was made entirely of human skulls that had been simply mortared together to make this tower. And then on top of the tower was an enormous framework of poles going up with cross pieces. And on these, they would thread skulls on these cross pieces. And the number of skulls was in the hundreds of thousands. This enormous monument of skulls was there right beside the main temple in the city. And so you can, it doesn't take much imagination knowing about the Aztec religion to know how that Tower of Skulls came to be. That's where they put the skulls of the people that they had sacrificed on the temple. And the way the sacrifice would happen was they would take someone top of the temple and they would cut their heart out while the heart was still beating and pull it out of their body, and then they would push the body down the steps. If you look at these temples of this kind of religion, the stairs are very steep, and the reason the stairs are very steep, so the body will roll all the way to the bottom. And then once the body rolled to the bottom, the people at the bottom would take the person and cook them and eat them. I don't know what was exactly going on in the religious ceremony that was attacked by the Spanish remaining in the city, but something made this person decide to just go on the offensive and take these people out. And I'm not at all excusing the action, but I am saying that when someone does something apparently crazy, finding the reason that it's not crazy is a good idea. And that, I think, has something to do with it. I really do. Maybe something was going on in that ceremony that this person just couldn't handle, and just said, we need to get rid of these people. Cortez returns to the city with these new soldiers, and he doesn't know this has happened. And they let him into the city. Now, the city is an island. It's in the middle of a lake. It's reached by some causeways that go from the shore of the lake to the city. And the causeways are broken in several places by bridges. And the reason for this is it makes the city nearly impregnable to attack. If you just take the bridges out, nobody can get in or out of the place. And so the Aztecs kind of pretend that everything's still copacetic until Cortez and his forces get into the city. And then they think, we've got these people trapped. And by this time, there's absolutely no illusions among the Aztecs whatsoever that these are gods. The jig is up, right? They have figured this thing out. According to legend, Moctezuma tries to placate the people and, goes out in front of them and says, no, wait a minute, I didn't get this wrong, these are real gods, and they just stone him to death. And that's kind of the beginning of the end here well, it is the end of this peaceful takeover of the Aztecs. The Aztecs take out the bridges, and Cortez and remember, there's several thousand native warriors with him as well, and now more than 1,000 Spanish knights. They've got no choice. They have to fight their way out of the city, and they do, with the entire population of the city trying to massacre them as they go through these narrow streets and wade across by one enormous stroke of luck. The lake that surrounded Tenochtitlan was not very deep, and you could actually get across some of these gaps. But Cortez does this at a terrible cost. Even with the advantage of steel and gunpowder, he loses all of his cannons immediately. Right? You can't drag cannons across these gaps in the causeways. Nearly all of them die. By the time Cortez reaches the shore, he has about 400 people left alive. All of them are wounded, and he has maybe a dozen horses left. They get a small ways out of the city and just collapse. And when the morning came, this happens at night. They fight their way out of the city at night. That morning, the entire Aztec army comes out of the city to basically mop up and annihilate Cortez and what's left of his forces. And Cortez takes this amazing gamble. He has figured out, he's realized the ceremonial nature of Aztec warfare, and he takes an enormous risk. He basically saddles up anybody that can still ride with their armor, and he leads this tiny little cavalry charge right through the middle of the Aztec army, and he takes out the Aztec commander. And this evidently, in the rules of warfare that the Aztecs were working under in their religious traditions, when the main guy goes down, battle's over, and the Aztecs disperse. And that allows Cortez to limp his way back into some of these surrounding villages where he recruits more people and uh, heals his wounded and goes to war. He began this long war of attrition against the Aztecs by basically turning every single outlying area against them and starving them out. And eventually he sacks and destroys Tenochtitlan. And the result of this is that the Spanish claim Mexico for the Kingdom of Spain, and Cortez himself becomes the de facto king of this new world. And there's a lot more that goes into it than that. That's just the bare bones of it, but it is an amazing story, isn't it? You couldn't make this up. Um, uh, it happened. This is history. And so, and that's that. I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating uh, aspect of that time and that place in history, and this conflict, this collision between two completely alien um, cultures with no shared history and with these religions that are antithetical to one another. I mean, honestly, from the time of the sack of Carthage, basically, until Cortez in Mexico, in Tenochtitlan, no representative of Western civilization had seen anything like what was going on in that city in terms of the way they worshiped their gods. Um, and that created a very a situation that was ripe for violence and uh, atrocities. Um, you can imagine, right? And then that, as it was circled back to this, right? You can see why maybe some of these people were like, well, are these really people? Are they or are they not? And that's an interesting question. It is. If we had been able to stay in class, there was a film I was going to show you. You might watch it yourself. It's called The 13th Warrior. That is it's a meditation on that. What is it? What does it mean to be a person, to be a human being? Can someone's religious and cultural traditions be so alien that they are, in effect, not human, or not? Right? I don't have an answer to that. Well, I would say no. I would side with the Pope right on that. No, doesn't matter. They're still people, right? Even if they do these things. Um, but uh, you can that background, that difference between these cultures, I think, explains a lot of the tragedy that follows and the devastation of these people and uh, that whole movement in history towards the conquering of the indigenous people of the Americas, which, as I said in our discussion question, lasts all the way up until the 20th century, right? Um, my father knew a man in Apache, Oklahoma, who had fought side by side with Geronimo. That's how recent the ending of this long steamrolling of these people by Western civilization. Um, that's how recent it ended. Um, Yesterday, essentially. And that leads to other questions. Some missionaries got in trouble just recently for trying to contact some uncontacted people in the Amazon. And there are people out there. There's still, and there's, I mentioned this, I think, in our discussion where there's a few islands where these people have never seen a representative of Western civilization. They're uncontacted, isolated natives peoples. And the missionaries were detained by the government, think of Brazil, like, you can't do this because, first of all, you'll kill them all. Right? You're going to bring diseases in here with you, just like when we first started this all those hundreds of years ago. And you're going to wipe them out in your desire to convert them to Christianity. Uh, how do we treat these people? Right? What's the right thing to do here? Um, is it worth destroying their culture and their religion and maybe their lives to bring them into what we think of as the benefits of civilization? I don't know. But this is where it begins. And as I said, it kind of ends in a major way with the last of the, well, really with the statehood of Oklahoma, the state we're sitting in. When Oklahoma stopped being Indian Territory and became a state of the Union, that was it, except for these very isolated people in these very remote areas of the world that still are essentially in the same place that the Aztecs were before Cortez found them. So that's that. We're done basically. As soon as you get the test done, it'll be up as soon as I get this video uploaded, and we will get to the end of the semester. Please catch up if you haven't yet. And once again, if you need to get in touch with me, please do.